In this video, we're going to talk about the principles of conditioning and learning, also known as the school of behaviorism in psychology. Behaviorism can be defined as a psychological orientation focused on measuring observable behavior rather than internal processes such as thoughts or feelings. Two champions of behaviorism are Ivan Pavlov on the left and B.F. Skinner on the right. Each contributed significant theories on behaviorism that demonstrate the psychological effects of conditioning. Behaviorists defined learning and conditioning as essentially the same process. Importantly, the learning process causes a relatively permanent change in knowledge or behavior resulting from experience. Conditioning and learning are the ability to psychologically connect stimuli in the environment with behavioral responses or actions. So based on this definition, learning is associative. Only a small subset of learning is academic, according to this theory, and most of it is experiential. Here's a picture of Ivan Pavlov and his crew. They are the ones famous for doing the studies with dogs and salivating, which I'll show you in more detail here. So based on this theory of classical conditioning, we have four categories of things: the unconditioned stimulus, or US, the unconditioned response, or UR, the conditioned stimulus, or CS, and the conditioned response, or CR. So the unconditioned stimulus, or US, is a stimulus that elicits a particular response without prior training. In this case, it's the food. The unconditioned response is a response that occurs to a stimulus without prior training. In this case, the salivating or drooling at the sight of the food. The conditioned stimulus is the stimulus that does not elicit a particular response initially, but comes to do so as a result of classical conditioning. In this case, we're talking about the bell or the whistle. And the conditioned response is the response that is eventually elicited by the conditioned stimulus after repeated pairings with the unconditioned stimulus. In this case, it's salivating at the sound of the bell or whistle. It's important to remember that the conditioning process doesn't happen right away. Just because you see something paired together once or twice doesn't mean you'll automatically have an association. Classically conditioned responses are built through sustained, repeated pairings. An example of classical conditioning in popular culture can be found in the TV show The Office, where Jim pranks Dwight by giving him a breath mint after each time his computer makes a sound. Check out the clip I posted on Canvas to see how it worked. Now, what happens after the response has been conditioned, but then over time the conditioned response is repeatedly removed from the conditioned stimulus? In a case like this, we might see extinction, where the conditioned stimulus no longer activates the conditioned response. If you ring the bell too many times without presenting any food, eventually the dog will stop salivating. But there's also something that can happen after extinction, which is called spontaneous recovery. This typically happens after a long pause with nothing, no stimuli being presented at all. Now, earlier I mentioned how classical conditioning takes sustained, repeated pairings in order to establish a conditioned response. Well, there's an exception to this, and it actually comes from evolutionary psychology. It's called taste aversion, also known as the Garcia effect. This is when we come to associate a specific taste with a negative response, like getting sick. Even after just one instance of being sick, we become averse to the taste of the last thing we ate. This is nature's way of protecting us from repeatedly eating a poisonous food. It's important to note that the Garcia effect only happens for taste and not for other senses. So if you merely saw a picture of the food that made you sick, it wouldn't trigger the same kind of conditioned response. What about the flip side of taste aversion, which might be an acquired taste? That is, something initially unpleasant that becomes more enjoyable over time. This also has roots in evolutionary psychology and behaviorism, which teaches us to enjoy things that are good for us, so we'll consume them more. Here's an excerpt from a study that describes this phenomenon. Research in both animals and humans suggests that we are very good at learning flavor preferences based on health needs. For example, scientists at the University of Utah intentionally fed sheep a diet that was low in phosphorus, which is a vital nutrient. Once the sheep developed a deficiency, they began giving them food that was flavored like maple, a flavor they had not encountered before, and immediately afterwards they would pump phosphorus directly into their stomachs. In other words, the sheep never tasted the phosphorus, just maple. From that point on, the sheep would show a major preference for maple-flavored food over their regular food, but only when they were phosphorus deficient. When the deficiency went away, so did the flavor preference. One more example here of classical conditioning, and this ties back to one of our previous videos about the placebo effect. In this case, we're looking at medicine and a phenomenon called biological conditioning. Basically, when you take a medicine repeatedly, your mind learns how it affects your body through classical conditioning. So biological conditioning is a mental association between a drug and its physical effect. For example, if you take a drug that suppresses the immune system a few times, your body learns the association between that drug and the suppressed immune response. If you continue to take a placebo pill, your body automatically responds with the same suppressed immune system response, and that happens automatically. It doesn't matter what you believe about the drug you're taking. This phenomenon of biological conditioning could potentially one day help us reduce drug dependence, reduce side effects of toxicity of drugs, as well as the cost. Now, moving on to operant conditioning, this is another type of conditioning that happens when a behavior is increased or decreased depending on what comes immediately after. For instance, scientists can reinforce small animals like chickens or mice to hit levers in a box if that action is followed by the reward of food. In operant conditioning, reinforcers increase behavior while punishers decrease behavior. Positive reinforcement and punishment involve the introduction of something new, while negative reinforcement and punishment involve taking something away. Here are some examples. Positive reinforcement, so remember this is introducing something in order to increase behavior. An example would be when a child puts toys away and receives a cookie. So something positive is added, thus the child learns to put their toys away again and again. The behavior increases. With negative punishment, this is about taking something away in order to decrease behavior. So for example, if a child is being mean to their sibling, you take away their toys, and then the child learns to stop being mean. The behavior decreases. Negative reinforcement involves withdrawing something to increase behavior. This is often why people become addicted to drugs. They learn that if they take a painkiller, whatever pain they were experiencing before will go away. Whatever pain they were experiencing before will go away, so the behavior increases. And finally, positive punishment involves introducing something to reduce the behavior. An example would be if you're late to a meeting and your boss shames or criticizes you in front of everybody, and then you learn to avoid being late in the future. The behavior decreases. This is a table of reinforcement schedules. Whenever a reinforcement is given, it can be ratio dependent or interval dependent. Ratio dependent means it's given after a number of the behaviors themselves, whereas interval reinforcers are given after a specific period of time. Fixed ratio involves the behavior reinforced after a specific number of responses. So this would be, for example, factory workers who are paid according to the number of products they produce. Variable ratio would be the behavior is reinforced after an average but unpredictable number of responses. And this is where we have the example of slot machines, payoffs, and other games of chance happening about an average but unpredictable number of times. Fixed interval involves behaviors being reinforced for the first response after a specific amount of time has passed. So, for example, people who earn a monthly salary. And then variable interval involves being reinforced for the first response after an average but unpredictable amount of time. So, for example, a person who waits for an elevator. This graph shows research on how effective these different reinforcement schedules are. So in general, we see that variable schedules are more effective at increasing behaviors compared to fixed schedules, and that ratio schedules are more effective than interval schedules. The most effective is variable ratio. This is the logic behind slot machines and gambling, and although I don't think there's a direct parallel, some people believe that slot machines are addictive specifically because they rely on variable ratio schedules. People are rewarded after a number of behaviors, and it changes moment to moment. Remember that in some experiments by B.F. Skinner, an animal would receive food every time it hit a button or lever. But sometimes the animals were just fed by the experimenter at regular times throughout the day. An interesting and unfortunate consequence of this is that whatever the animal was doing at that particular moment would be reinforced by the food. So, if a bird in the experiment was rotating its head at the time it received food, it would believe that the head rotation caused the food to appear, and then would keep rotating its head whenever it was hungry. But this could be any behavior. So another animal might stomp their foot if that's what they happen to be doing when the food arrived. Skinner identified these as superstitious behaviors in animals because they weren't actually connected to the outcome, but the animals believed that they were. And he likened these to superstitious behaviors in humans, like if something good happens when you're wearing a particular hat, you might falsely believe it's a lucky hat and keep wearing it for that reason. Now, there's one more type of learning that we'll discuss here, which is different from classical and operant conditioning, and that's observational learning. This is based on the idea that if nothing is conditioned or rewarded, people will still mimic others' behavior. And this is where the term role models comes from, and one of the famous studies in psychology called the Bobo doll experiment by Albert Bandura. In the Bobo doll experiment, an adult, in this case a social model, interacts with a Bobo doll in front of a child observer. In some instances, the adult behaves aggressively towards the doll by kicking or punching it, and in other times, the adult is gentle or playful. The results showed that the children who were exposed to the aggressive adult model were significantly more likely to mimic the aggressive behavior themselves toward the doll compared to those who saw the non-aggressive adult. Social learning theory involves 4 parts or stages: attention, which means the observer needs to be focused on the task being learned; retention, which means the observer must be able to retain the learned information in memory; initiation, which means the observer must be able to perform the task, and this requires access and ability; and motivation, the observer wants to perform the learned task. When all of those are in place, then we see observational learning at its peak.